Hello and welcome to the Asian Peace Talks. This is a podcast series launched by the Asian Peace Program of the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. The goal of the Asian Peace Program is a noble one: to try and preserve and strengthen peace in Asia. With our limited resources, we have to take a modest approach. Nonetheless, just as a small acupuncture needle can make a big difference, we hope that our monthly policy essays and this podcast series will make a big difference and strengthen the peace regimes in Asia. I am Kishore Mahbubani, the head and coordinator of the Asian Peace Program and the host of the Asian Peace Talks. I'm pleased to inform you that we're launching a new segment as part of this podcast series. This segment will feature in-depth interviews with scholars conducted by Jyoti Malhotra, a seasoned journalist and interviewer whose repertoire includes associations with BBC News, the Indian Express, and the Print. In this episode, Jyoti will be interviewing Sarang Shidore, Director of Studies at the Quincy Institute, on his recently published Asian Peace Program essay, Safer Together: Why South and Southeast Asia Must Cooperate to Prevent a New Cold War in Asia. If you want to read Sarang's essay, you can view it at our website. Do enjoy this podcast.
I'm with Sarang Shidore, the Director of Studies at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a think tank in Washington, D.C. I'm Jyoti Malhotra in New Delhi. And today we're discussing the article that Mr. Shidore wrote on the website of the National University of Singapore's Asia Research Institute. The piece is called Safer Together: Why South and Southeast Asia Must Cooperate to Prevent a New Cold War in Asia. And I would encourage you viewers to go to the website and take a look at this piece. Welcome, Mr. Shidore, to this discussion.
Thank you very much for having me, Jyoti.
So, Mr. Shidore, the burden of your argument in your piece is that a new Cold War may be brewing in South and Southeast Asia. Of course, you haven't gone as far as to say that, but you're basically talking about the U.S China rivalry that is coming closer and closer together, affecting Southeast Asia, the 10 ASEAN states, as well as South Asia, in which India and Pakistan, of course, are the biggest states. But my first question to you is, why do you think that this is happening in Southeast Asia?
Right. So, as you said, I do not say that there is a Cold War underway or a sort of a tense situation that we had between the US and Soviet Union, because that is not the situation now. However, there is a risk of some sort of escalated security competition between the United States and China. And to the extent that that happens, that affects other parts of Asia. And potentially that could include South Asia and Southeast Asia. These are the two regions more likely to be affected by this rivalry, should it sharpen. It's not set in stone yet, but the risks are growing just given the last 3 or 4 years. The trajectory that we are seeing between the two countries is not going in a cooperative direction. It's going in an antagonistic direction.
Right. So now you are... sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, please.
So I was saying that, you're in Washington, D.C., I'm in New Delhi, and the Asia Research Institute is in Singapore. So we're really connecting the time zones, as it were. But, Singapore is in the heart of the Southeast Asian region that you're talking about, a key member of the ASEAN states. So this rivalry that you talk about between the US and China, and you say it's sharpening now, but how is the ASEAN going to be affected by this?
Right. So ASEAN has been a very successful bloc historically. If you look at the economies of the 10 ASEAN states about 30 years ago versus now, there's a phenomenal difference.
Mhm.
In fact, with a population of about 620 million, the GDP of ASEAN is going to overtake that of Japan by 2030. Now, Japan, of course, is a smaller country, but the point is that most of these countries were very poor 30 years ago. Vietnam, for example, was essentially flattened by the war with the United States, and the other countries were not particularly much richer either, with the exception of perhaps Singapore and a couple of others. So it's come a long way, and it's achieved that through creating a zone of integration, economic integration, of trade, of certain bedrock principles that respect more old-fashioned approaches to international relations, such as non-intervention in internal affairs of other countries, and also a decision styled by consensus. So this has served ASEAN well, uh, but it's also had an advantage that the Cold War ended, and the United States and the Soviet Union, of course, didn't exist anymore. And the US and China had a sort of an understanding for much of the period after the fall of the Soviet Union. They had differences, but they managed them, and trade and economics and other kinds of cooperation were stressed more, perhaps, than the differences over issues such as Taiwan, or human rights and things of that sort. So, in that process, it gave some space for ASEAN to build something out of a very diverse region. It's a highly diverse region, but yet we have not seen any real conflict between those countries. If anything, only positive some cooperation. Now, that, however, is subject to stress. If the US and China, as we are seeing today, continue along the current trend and reach a point of much sharper security rivalry, then pressures grow naturally based on historical observation on these countries to take a position on one side or the other. Those pressures grow. It doesn't mean that they necessarily will do that, but they will have a harder time fending off those pressures. And to that extent, and also coupled with the deglobalization of sorts that is taking place, a trade war like situation between the US and China, which is having a ripple effect across other parts of the world, means that ASEAN's big calling card to prosperity, which was economic integration and free trade in large measure, is also under stress. And that doesn't help Southeast Asia continue along its path of prosperity.
So, do you think that Southeast Asia or the ASEAN states, do you think they're divided in their, in their relationships that they have both with China and the US?
Yes, indeed, they are. There are different tendencies among Southeast Asian states towards, let's say, a preferential tilt towards one power or the other. It's been actually more with the US, because historically the US has had alliance systems in Asia, and that includes, in Southeast Asia, includes Thailand and the Philippines, as well as a very strong security relationship with Singapore. And indeed, a couple of other countries also have those sorts of cooperative relationships, including Indonesia to some extent. So, in a sense, it's advantage US in terms of the historical associations. Also, a lot of goodwill in Southeast Asia for the United States. There's been a lot of investment from the US. So, historical cards in some ways are tilting towards the US. However, China is now the largest trading partner of ASEAN by far, overtaking any other country, including the US. And money talks. And countries such as ASEAN that are so focused on an economic development story, these are developmental states for the most part. They haven't let themselves caught up in rivalries or military competition and things like that. For them, this sort of dependence on China, and indeed benefits that they accrue from the trade with China, are going to weigh quite considerably, and they do. So the challenge for ASEAN is to not have this escalate, and to maintain ideally good relations with both sides.
Yes, and I think that's something that I'm sure each of the 10 ASEAN states must be considering and wondering how to deal with. But can I ask you? You have said that you've talked about how the U.S. has such close relationships with each of the Southeast Asian nations, the ASEAN nations. You talk about how the US remains the largest investor in this region, although you do say that China is the largest trading partner. But having said that, in your piece, you do also, it seems to be, you seem to be quite critical about the manner in which the US has handled this, this rivalry, if you like, with China in the region. For example, you say that the US has whittled away at its own one China policy. It's catapulted Australia onto the status of a frontline state against China. And you're actually quite aghast at the manner in which the US Congress has introduced Cold War language, Cold War era language, if you like, in talking about China. So what, explain to us what you mean when you say these things.
Yeah, I think historically the record of the US has been very constructive in Southeast Asia, but things have changed in recent years, and that's actually not focused on Southeast Asia. This is a collateral damage sort of situation brewing for the ASEAN states. It's really the way the US is looking at the rivalry with China. And for many decades, as I said, this was seen as a mixed bag, but the conclusion has been arrived at by many in Washington, not all, but many in Washington, that this cannot continue. China's rise is now actually almost entirely a threat. The opportunity part of the China equation has been reduced to climate change, essentially, and maybe North Korea to some extent. Not a whole lot of other big items. Even as we said, economics and trade has become now a problem, not an opportunity. So this is not a positive thing. Now, of course, it takes two hands to clap, and we have seen Chinese assertions and intrusions in the region. But nevertheless, there are certain, let's say, keystones or core foundational aspects of U.S.-China competition, such as the One China policy and what's called strategic ambiguity over Taiwan that the United States has maintained for decades. And that strategic ambiguity is to essentially work with Taiwan as an independent country, but not take a position on its final status, have even a defense relationship with Taiwan, but not make any commitments in the sense that it has with Japan or South Korea. Those are alliances. Those are mutual defense commitments. With Taiwan, there is no alliance. So what is going on at the moment is, at one level, the administration is saying we are not changing our One China policy and our Taiwan policy. At another level, there are these moves that are eroding that long-standing arrangement. Now, the long-standing arrangement is not of vital interest. Taiwan is not a vital interest to the US in the way it is for China, because from the Chinese standpoint, Taiwan is a part of China. Because many Taiwanese disagree. But it is a sort of a territorial question that many post-colonial states are very sensitive about across the world, Asia and Africa, indeed Latin America too. So for the United States, Taiwan is half a world away. And although it's in the interest of the US to ensure that Taiwan continues to succeed, indeed has the means to defend itself, it is not in the interest of the US to have a sharp clash over Taiwan, or indeed a military escalatory cycle over Taiwan, leading to the worst case, of course, leading to a war. And so it seems to me that the balance of interests favors China in this case, and the US policy has not been helpful in recent years on the Taiwan question. But also on other questions, on trade, there are serious issues with the way Chinese conduct themselves. But on the other hand, there are also many benefits that the trade with China has brought to US consumers over decades, such as low prices and low inflation for 3 decades. So again, here, securitizing trade beyond certain aspects that need to be let's say, re-examined is not in the interest of the US or the world or the region or China, of course.
Right. You mentioned Taiwan. Now, we've seen how the Taiwanese have scrambled their jets most recently, accusing the Chinese of breaching their air defense zone. But you also say in your piece, and this was written last month, so I'd like to, to sort of put this caveat out in front to my audience. You say in your piece that China is expanding its military footprint. not just in Southeast Asia, but we've seen in India, for example, when in Ladakh over the last a year and a half, the Chinese have intruded across the line of actual control. But can you talk a little bit about what this means and what states of the region, how they are dealing with this sort of expanding Chinese sort of military footprint?
There's no question that the Chinese, as China has grown much richer, China has also modernized its military, and there are many ways it's done that. Now, I'm not an expert on the Chinese military per se, but I think some facts are very clear and out there. For example, the Chinese have reorganized their military into theater commands in a way similar to what the U.S. does, and indeed other countries are also doing, including India. That's been one major reform. It's also going for a much leaner military, so much more technology heavy, focusing on cyber, electronic warfare, and things of that sort, and including AI. The Chinese have also expanded their navy massively. So historically, of course, the communist revolution and all of China's threats during the Cold War were continental. Russia was seen as a major, Soviet Union was seen as a threat. There was, of course, a conflict with India. There were also not very good relations. In fact, a war with Vietnam. So, although Japan was always a concern, there was a focus much more on the terrestrial part. But now the Chinese are focusing very heavily on the maritime aspects, and the Chinese Navy is actually the largest navy in the world. It's bigger than the U.S. Navy now. Of course, you have to add the navies of allies of the U.S., and then it's a little bit of a different picture. But nevertheless, China is catching up fast in terms of certain spaces. Other spaces, China is massively outgunned by the U.S., such as nuclear weapons, military bases, allies. China doesn't even compare to the United States.
So, I couldn't help noticing in your piece, Mr. Shidore, that when you said that the Chinese have incursions across the LAC, the line of actual control, you use the word alleged, that these are alleged incursions across the line of actual control. I'm wondering why you use that word.
Well, they are. What we see is two contradictory things. One is there is a lot of reporting that there have indeed been incursions. On the other hand, the official Indian government has officially denied that there have been incursions. There have been attempted incursions, and India has actually repelled those incursions and stood firm. So that's the reason. But it seems that a lot of the on-the-ground reporting and just looking at China's other sorts of activities in the neighborhood, it is probably more likely that there have actually been incursions than not.
Right. So just to sort of shift the focus a little bit from Southeast Asia to South Asia, although as you do mention in your piece, there are huge, the relationship between both these regions is quite interesting, especially India with its Look East policy. But tell me, with India being a part of the Quad, which is Australia, Japan, India, and the US, how does the region, how does Southeast Asia look at India being part of this Quad, which is really like a sort of a coalition against China, or at least seeking to contain China?
I think the Southeast Asians welcome certain aspects of the Quad. So, for example, the joint statement that came out of the Leaders Summit essentially focused on what global public goods types of agenda. So things like health, in which India, of course, is a major player, but also climate change. And we know, and COP26 is underway at the moment, and we know that climate change, the prognosis is just more certain and more terrible as we know more. So indeed, climate change is a security threat. It's not just a issue of human development and human welfare. So in many ways,
also COVID vaccine diplomacy. I think that's one big part of
yes, of course. So I think Southeast Asian states welcome that. On the other hand, they are not inclined to join the Quad. I mean, you've seen probably many appeals and many there's preferences from the side of Quad partners that at least some Southeast Asian states start working closely with the Quad or even join the Quad, but they have stayed away from that formally And that's because, again, they are trying to strike a balance between the US and China, and the Quad's military aspects, which are not officially a part of Quad, but nevertheless are between the same four states, are not necessarily something that the Southeast Asian states want to be a part of.
India has also said that it will only go along with the non-military determinants of this Quad coalition. So basically, I'm not sure whether India wants to also sort of directly or overtly confront China. I mean, we have this, the Chinese presence across the line of actual control. You're absolutely right that the Indian government has not formally accepted that, but that's quite interesting, isn't it? That while the US and Japan, for example, may have wanted a more aggressive, if you like, posture, but the Indians have sort of pulled back.
That's right. I think India is trying to walk a fine line. At one level, it obviously has a close relationship with the US, and it will always have a preferential tilt towards the US for a lot of reasons, including the fact that there are 4.5 million Indian Americans in this country. But on the other side, India knows well that its biggest vulnerabilities to Asia are not maritime, but they are continental. In fact, the only maritime attack that's happened against India, the vicious one at that, has come from Pakistani soil. We saw that, of course, with the 26/11 attacks in Mumbai. So, of course, the maritime question is important, and India has beefed up its navy, and the Indian Ocean is India's sort of lake, so to speak, in terms of its presence. But I think the immediate threat, and indeed we have seen that last year, is continental. And there, the United States cannot be expected to play a role. It's not. It is very far from U.S. vital interests of any kind to be present in those parts of the Asian geography. Of course, the U.S. can help in terms of intelligence and other ways, but India is really on its own. And so, and the other factor is India, of course, has a good relationship with Russia. And what we are seeing right now in Asia and the global system is a Russian-Chinese convergence, which has nothing to do with India. It has everything to do with the way the US and Russia, where they are headed, and where, of course, the U.S. China relationship is going. So a Russian Chinese convergence is not in the Indian interest, which starts looking a little bit like a embryonic block. And so India would not like to encourage block formation and hard, let's say, hard contestations between groups of nations, which starts looking more and more like a Cold War light or Cold War light scenario. And so India is, I believe, going to walk a finer line on this question.
Yes, I think you're right that India is walking a fine line, not just between the US on the one hand, with which it's increasingly growing closer to, but also China on the other. I mean, it was quite interesting that, despite the incursions across the LAC with Chinese troops sort of sitting either on your soil or what India considers to be its territory, during the pandemic, actually India's trade with China grew in favor of China. So that is something that I think the Indian policy makers are very, very aware of, that while you can sort of rhetoric must match reality in some ways. But let me just come back to your piece and let's talk a little bit about, you talk about sort of like your headline, for example, which says that why South and Southeast Asia must cooperate in preventing this new Cold War within quotes in Asia. But the fact is that South Asia is as diverse, if not more diverse than Southeast Asia. I mean, India and Pakistan, for example, have the worst relationship right now. Sri Lanka is also quite close to China. The Bangladeshis have signed an agreement with the Chinese on many fronts, including in defense. So how this sort of suggestion of yours, or exhortation, if you like, for South Asia and Southeast Asia to come together is a bit of a pipe dream, isn't it?
Well, everything that one hopes for in the ideal world can be a pipe dream or can be a goal that is to be attempted. We are seeing that again in the climate change talks. We have a very ambitious goal as a world, and we are quite short of it. But nevertheless, it doesn't stop countries from trying with all the acrimony that involves, and all the sort of jostling that involves. So I think the bottom line, what I'm really trying to say here is that there are every country in the region. Take Vietnam. Vietnam has a very serious uh, threat from China in terms of its maritime claims. It's also had a war with China in '79. That's 40 years ago, about 42 years ago. The India-China war was 17 years prior to that.
Right.
But the Vietnamese have played a very interesting game in terms of they have not given up on their claims on China. They're very sharp on that, and they make that very clear. On the other hand, they have also maintained a very strong economic relationship with China. Indeed, Vietnam is the supply chains that are to some extent moving out of China. Vietnam is one of the major beneficiaries of that because it hasn't given up on its economic game. And so security, yes, but economics for a developing country in some ways in the long run is even more important. And this is where I think for South Asia, and I'm again referring more because the Pakistan situation is kind of a sui generis, but India and the other countries in South Asia uh, may realize that the bigger threat in the long run is a bloc formation and a Cold War like situation developing across the region. And it's in their interest to uh, complicate that situation, not to, and indeed that doesn't rule out tilts, but not to hasten that process. So it's a challenge of diplomacy, it's a challenge of plurilateralism of the region of many countries. But this is not the first time that such challenges have come up in international relations. And India indeed has been a leader in taking some of these challenges on in its earlier history.
Okay, so specifically, Mr. Shidore, what should the ASEAN do to pick its way carefully? How can it pick its way carefully between this U.S. China growing rivalry?
I think it's going to be difficult for ASEAN to reach a common position that's more adventurous than the current one. It has a ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific that's a very broad sort of a document. It says many good things. We can agree, everyone can agree on most of those things. But I think the rubber meets the road, certain positions may be necessary. And if ASEAN can't take them as a collective body, then certain subsets of ASEAN states could. For example, obviously the Chinese intrusions are not acceptable to all ASEAN countries, or certainly the claimant states. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, alliances such as AUKUS that were suddenly announced without consultation with Indonesia, which is a proximate neighbor of Australia, has in the past had difficult relations with Australia, although relations are much better now. There's a first world, third world kind of dynamic there as well. There was a great need to bring these countries into confidence. So we heard a lot about the French situation, but really the Southeast Asians being surprised with this very clear military alliance involving offensive submarines, nuclear submarines. That's a long-term thing, but nevertheless is a very, very clearly a security goal, as well as potentially much enhanced U.S. presence in Australia. These are of great concern to neighboring countries in Southeast Asia, and I think they might benefit from stepping in sooner rather than later and drawing the line on some of these actions from both sides, the Chinese side and the US-led side, that are not helpful for overall stability.
Yes, I saw that you were quite critical of the AUKUS alliance, but wouldn't you say then that the US is only protecting its turf and that it's going to do everything in its ability, in its power to protect its perch as world number one?
Yeah, that may be what's going on. The US in many ways is, one can argue that it's not the US mainland that is threatened by China's rise, because the US is so far away. It has 15 times roughly as many nuclear weapons. They're on head trigger alert. It has allies in the region and deployed troops. It has 750 bases worldwide. China has just one foreign base. So it's not so much that the U.S. is threatened by a Chinese invasion or a Chinese attack. It is U.S. dominance in the region that is threatened by China's rise. And protecting dominance is a different thing from protecting the people of a country. And so I think the United States needs to think hard whether perpetual dominance is indeed possible. Even multi-decade dominance is indeed possible, just from a realist perspective. Is that sustainable? And also, of course, from the perspective of an overall world order that perhaps is desirable, that may not be the ideal solution that many countries would want. I think a more multipolar world is something what many middle powers certainly would desire.
And yet China is also exhibiting dominance, isn't it? I mean, they're looking for a base in Cambodia, for example, which is the heart of the ASEAN.
Yes, China is looking for much greater role in Asia, a potentially hegemonic role. This is an ongoing debate. What does China want? Or does China even know what it wants? Or what would China want in 20 years? One theory says that, like every empire of the past, China is also an empire, and it will want to maximize its dominance, if possible, globally. Another argument is that China is looking for first among equals, or number one status in Asia, but not necessarily the sort of 700 plus military bases girding the world, because it knows that that game is not necessarily the game of the future. It's mainly an economic and technological power. So regardless of which camp you're on, we have to agree that China is very, very far away from global dominance at the moment. It's even not really in a position of regional dominance, because middle powers such as Japan, India, South Korea, indeed even the Southeast Asian states, these are not pushover countries. And if Chinese behavior goes much beyond what it is now, there will be responses. So the Chinese are also hemmed in by geography. I mean, if you look at the geography of neighboring countries, there are a lot of islands there that are not necessarily friends of China. So all put together, China doesn't have an easy path to just dominate Asia, as we might think. I think it's going to be a tough game for China. Certainly, if it uses military tools, I think it will face enormous resistance and will end up in quagmires like indeed the U.S. experienced in the Middle East.
But you've seen that this is happening in India, which is what happened in Ladakh last year in June in the Galwan Valley. So I suppose in India, perhaps we look at things a little bit differently from where other centers in the world do. But Mr. Shidore, thank you so much for your time and for speaking to me. This video discussion, I would encourage my viewers again to read your piece on the website of the Asia Research Institute. And thank you again so much for speaking to me.
Thank you very much, Jyoti. Glad to be here.
Thank you.